Egypt has spent the past decade walking a financial tightrope. On one side sits a vast and fast-growing economy. On the other sits a mountain of debt that has been climbing year after year. By late 2023, the country's external debt had surged to around $168 billion, up from roughly $123.5 billion just 3 years earlier. And by 2026, Egypt is staring at one of the most intense repayment schedules in the developing world. Roughly $28 billion in external obligations are due in the first quarter of the year alone, while nearly $66.6 billion will mature within 12 months. Under normal circumstances, numbers like these trigger financial crisis. Currencies collapse, governments slash spending, economies stall. But that isn't what's happening in Egypt. Instead of simply scrambling to pay down its obligation, the government has launched a sweeping economic strategy designed to fundamentally change how the country manages its debt. And the deeper you look into that strategy, the clearer it becomes that Egypt isn't just trying to survive a debt crisis. It's attempting something much more unusual. Because to understand what Egypt is doing today, you first need to understand how the country's economic system actually works. At the center of that system is a simple but powerful reality. Egypt relies heavily on foreign currency. The country imports vast quantities of essential goods, food, industrial materials, energy inputs, and manufactured products flow into Egyptian ports every year to support one of the largest populations in the Middle East and North Africa. But imports must be paid for in foreign currency, usually US dollars. And Egypt's exports alone are not large enough to fully cover that bill. So the country has historically relied on a collection of foreign currency inflows to keep the system balanced. Tourism is one of them. Remittances from Egyptians working abroad are another. Transit fees from ships passing through the Suez Canal generate billions of dollars annually. Foreign investment and international loans fill the remaining gaps. When these inflows remain strong, Egypt's financial system functions relatively smoothly. Dollars flow into the economy, imports are paid for, and external debts can be serviced. But when those inflows weaken, the system quickly comes under pressure. And over the past decade, the pressure has grown significantly. Beginning in the mid-2010s, Egypt embarked on one of the most ambitious development drives in its modern history. Massive infrastructure projects were launched across the country. Highways, energy networks, industrial zones, and entirely new urban developments began rising from the desert. One of the most prominent examples is the new administrative capital, a vast city project intended to relieve pressure on Cairo and reshape the country's economic geography. These projects were designed to modernize the economy and attract long-term investment, but they also required enormous financing. To fund them, Egypt borrowed heavily from international markets and financial institutions, including programs supported by the International Monetary Fund. External debt climbed steadily, eventually peaking at about $168 billion in 2023. At the same time, global events complicated the situation. The COVID-19 pandemic disrupted tourism revenues. The war in Ukraine pushed up global food and energy prices, and rising global interest rates made borrowing more expensive across emerging markets. Suddenly, Egypt's financial balancing act became much harder to sustain. Debt servicing costs climbed rapidly. Today, interest payments are the largest single expenditure in the Egyptian state budget, consuming nearly half of the country's export revenues. And this is where the system began to encounter its most serious structural challenge. Egypt wasn't just carrying a large debt load, it was carrying that debt under extremely tight timelines. The average maturity of the country's public debt has historically been relatively short, hovering around 3.5 years. That means large portions of the debt must be refinanced or repaid frequently. Economists often refer to this situation as a repayment wall, and for Egypt, that wall is significant. With tens of billions of dollars coming due within short time frames, the government must constantly secure new sources of foreign currency simply to keep the system functioning. Under these conditions, many countries resort to harsh austerity measures or emergency bailouts. But Egypt has begun pursuing a more complex strategy. Rather than relying purely on new loans, the government is attempting to reshape the structure of its debt itself. The first element of this strategy involves something known as debt-to-equity swaps. Instead of repaying certain debts in cash, Egypt negotiates agreements with creditor countries or institutions to convert those obligations into investments or development projects inside the country. In practical terms, this means a creditor may cancel part of a loan in exchange for funding a specific project or gaining a stake in a long-term development initiative. Egypt has already begun building a sizable program around this idea. The government is targeting roughly $20 billion in debt swap agreements as part of broader economic reforms. Some of these deals involve European partners. A tranche with Germany, for example, channels roughly 100 million euros into technical education and green energy initiatives. Others involve major emerging partners. A $1.2 billion swap with China is converting debt into interest-free development loans. And in some cases, the scale is even larger. Egypt is currently negotiating the conversion of more than $10 billion in deposits from Saudi Arabia's central bank into investment stakes tied to development projects along the Red Sea. These arrangements reduce Egypt's external liabilities while simultaneously attracting investments into key sectors of the economy. But debt swaps aren't only one piece of the broader strategy. A second pillar focuses on something known as asset monetization. In simple terms, the Egyptian government is gradually selling stakes in state-owned companies and national assets to private investors. This approach is part of a broader reform effort known as the state ownership policy, which aims to reduce the direct role of the government in large parts of the economy while expanding private sector participation. Under the current plan, at least 40 state-owned companies will be transferred to the country's sovereign wealth fund and prepared for listing on the Egyptian Stock Exchange. The sectors involved include banking, petrochemicals, and even airport operations. And there is an important rule attached to these sales. At least half of all proceeds must be used directly to repay debt. In other words, state assets are being converted into financial liquidity that can be used to stabilize the country's balance sheet. Some of the most dramatic examples of this strategy involve large international investment deals. In 2024, the United Arab Emirates announced a $35 billion investment agreement tied to the development of Ras El Hekma, a major coastal project that will transform a stretch of Mediterranean shoreline into a new tourism and business hub. Deals like this bring enormous inflows of foreign currency into Egypt's financial system. But the strategy goes further. The third pillar focuses on fiscal discipline. To slow the growth of new debt, the government has introduced strict limits on public spending and aggressive efforts to increase revenue. Public investment has been capped at about 1 trillion Egyptian pounds, roughly $20 billion, to prevent excessive borrowing for new projects. Energy subsidies are being gradually reduced. Tax collection systems are being modernized to capture revenue more efficiently. The government is targeting a 34% increase in tax revenue during the 2025-2026 fiscal year without introducing new taxes, largely by closing loopholes and improving enforcement. Together, these measures are designed to generate a primary budget surplus of about 4%. That surplus then can be used to steadily reduce the overall debt burden. But there is still another challenge to address. Even if the total size of Egypt's debt declines, the timing of repayments still matters. And this leads to the fourth pillar of the strategy: liability management. Instead of allowing large amounts of debt to mature in short bursts, Egypt is working to extend the average maturity of its obligations. The goal is to shift the average maturity from roughly 3.5 years toward 5 years. This may sound like a technical adjustment, but the implications are significant. Longer maturities reduce the frequency of refinancing cycles and lower the risk of sudden liquidity crisis. At the same time, Egypt is exploring new financing instruments known as thematic bonds, including green and social bonds, which often carry lower borrowing costs because they are tied to environmental or development goals. These efforts have already begun to produce some measurable results. After peaking at nearly 96% of GDP in 2023, Egypt's public debt ratio has gradually declined. By mid-2025, it had fallen to around 85.6%, and early estimates for 2026 placed the ratio at roughly 85.1%. The government's official target is to reduce that figure to 80% by mid-2026, then 77% by 2027, and eventually 68% by 2030. Alongside these efforts, international support continues to play an important role. In February 2026, the International Monetary Fund completed its fifth and sixth program reviews for Egypt, unlocking approximately $2.3 billion in additional funding. The government also plans to issue roughly $2 billion in international bonds to help manage the remaining financing gap. But when you step back and look at the full strategy, a broader pattern begins to emerge. Egypt is not relying on a single solution. It is simultaneously restructuring its debts, selling assets, attracting foreign investments, reforming fiscal policy, and extending repayment timelines. Each of these measures provides relief in a different way. Together, they create a financial buffer that allows the country to navigate one of the most difficult debt environments in the developing world. And in many ways, Egypt's strategy reflects a much larger shift that is unfolding across the global economy. For decades, countries facing heavy debt burdens typically had only a few options: borrow more, impose austerity, or default. But the financial landscape is changing. Today, governments are increasingly turning to hybrid solutions that combine investment, asset transfers, and structural reforms to manage their liabilities. And this brings us to the deeper strategic reality behind Egypt's approach. The country's debt strategy is not simply about reducing numbers on a balance sheet. It is about maintaining financial stability in a world where capital flows, geopolitical alliances, and development ambitions are becoming increasingly intertwined. Because in the modern global economy, the real challenge is no longer just how countries borrow money. It is how they transform financial pressure into long-term economic partnerships. And Egypt may be showing how that transformation works. If this helped you to understand the strategy behind Egypt's economic moves, like and subscribe. And if you want to explore the next shift in the global economic landscape, click the video on your screen.